my animations have moved me on to going the whole around humans and other animals. And really what this is the beginning of trying to look at the impact of Darwin's ideas. Let's see if there's a nice orang sitting there. This is the trajectory of the lecture. Orang to the satirised Darwin, half ape, half man. This is what we're thinking about, man's place in nature. This is what we're thinking about. Does the origin of species transform our understanding of our own nature, our own human nature? So a lot of what's going to follow from now on, including this lecture, is not necessarily exploring the ins and outs of Darwin's theory. That has to come into it, but exploring its impact. And the first impact we're looking at is that issue of man's place in nature. Does Darwin's view put forward in the origin transform our understanding of who we are as people? Now, I put this in, Piltdown Man and the Missing Link, because as many of you will be aware, there has been this incredible drive ever since Darwin wrote his book to establish the missing link between men and apes. And one of those missing links was this fabulous cranium that was discovered in 1912 at Piltdown in Sussex in the south of England. Charles Dawson, an archaeologist, discovers a skull which he claims as the missing link between primates and humans. It seemed to develop an intermediate stage between the two. In 1953, it was revealed as a forgery. People finally figured out that it was part skull of person, part jaw of chimp, and had basically been stuck together. And it became this kind of detective story. Who was responsible for this particular hoax? For a while, Conan Doyle was in the frame for the hoax, but it turns out it was probably the discoverer, Dawson. You should always take Occam's razor to this problem. Who discovered the skull? Dawson. Who was most likely to be the perpetrator of the hoax? Dawson. Who was going to get the most kudos out of the discovery? Dawson. But what it reveals is this deep desire to understand what our connections are with our animal past, what the implications of that connection are. How does it transform our understanding of ourselves? So it was one of a long line of missing links. Now, one of the first missing links was purported to be the Neanderthals. We know now that they're just another species of the human family. Neanderthal man, Homo sapiens. We share a common ancestor, a common Homo ancestor. But for a while it was thought that Neanderthals were the missing link between the apes and human beings. And of course, their place in the story has been one of constant debate. Not a month goes by without a new Neanderthal story about how we've been unfair to the Neanderthals. How was it Homo sapiens aggression that wiped them out? What was it that made them go extinct? And why do we share some of our DNA with Neanderthals? And what I would maintain is that when we're thinking about this, a lot of what we're thinking about is human nature. A lot of what we're thinking about is who we are. And a lot of the way that people use Darwinism is to explain the way that we behave. Now, later on, we'll be talking about things like sociobiology and evolutionary psychology. Evolutionary psychology that attempts to maintain that we are, in effect, trapped in this bind of having what they call Stone Age minds in modern bodies. Their notion is that our behaviour, the way we go about doing life, the way that we conduct ourselves, the way that society is organised, is all a product of our out-of-Africa inheritance. So there are going to be a lot of people in this story that take origin and use origin to try and elucidate what it is to be human and why we behave the way that we behave. So that's basically the fundamentals of what I'm wanting to talk about in this lecture. So Darwin and animals, one place to start looking for a potential revolution. Did we understand ourselves, our human nature, different? David Armstrong, one of the principal medical sociologists of his day, rampant Foucauldian, speaking in his New History of Identity about what he believes the Darwinian revolution is. The Bible provided Western societies with their story of how that should be man, not many, was created. In the mid-19th century, however, this accepted account of creation was usurped with the publication of Darwin's Origin and Descent. More than simply presenting a novel scientific theory, these two books laid the foundation for a completely new story of creation in which man had its beginnings in a long-distant evolutionary past. So there we are. Man, animal, animal, man, new creation story, new understanding of human nature. He lays it out on the line in a New History of Identity. And I don't think that this view is particularly uncommon. And today we recognise that origin revolutionises how we think about species. Fixed, unchangeable species were replaced with a working transmutation, evolution as it had become by the 1870s. It rejected Lamarck's single ancestor, and it notes that species are related to all other species on this branching tree of descent. So for Darwin, his species were descended from a single common ancestor, individual members of a population competing for scarce resources. The individual members of a population competing for scarce resources best adapted survive. Offspring inherit favourable adaptations. Mechanism rejected by Darwin's most fervent followers. But they do accept the issue of common descent. Okay? That's really critical to establish here. People like Huxley, they like common descent. They believe in common descent. It ties in very nicely with the kind of morphological anatomy that they're doing. It ties in very well with that. Natural selection, no. But we can accept that a dog and a human, for example, have a common ancestor way back when. So, and of course, you know, think about it. Dog, human, common ancestor. That means that there must be some similarities in terms of our nature and our behaviour, which go back to that common ancestor. In fact, that's something that Darwin will argue in The Descent. A reason that you can discern a dog looking happy or a dog expressing fear in terms of its face, the reason that those similarities are there are because of that common descent thing. That's what Darwin believed. Sociobiologists and evolutionary psychologists believe that that's all about out of Africa. But for Darwin, those kind of expressions of the inner nature of the animal and the similarities that there might be with humans were indication of that issue of common descent. And what we see is this shift from that model of the great chain of being with the heaven and the... I'm just going to... it's not going quick enough when I want it to. It's not skipping me through this at the speed I want. We've seen the great chain. We've seen the way that humans are hived off but still connected to the rest of the animal kingdom. Connected because of the way that creation had occurred under the Creator. And I always feel, I only put hell in there because there's a drawing of it. I don't think hell fits into that model particularly well. I think that hell is a bit of a problem. But of course, we don't move straight from this model to origin. We go through other models. We go through that model of degeneration, for example, that we saw earlier. The 39 original species degenerating into other variations or species. We go through that. We also, of course, go through Lamarck's single ancestor, the simple to complex organism, the branching chain of being, rather than the branching tree of life. Each species here does emerge from a single ancestor species, with its process constrained by environment. The chimp, the orangutan, the Neanderthal all form this series of the upward progression of life. So we can already see that actually, if you look at Lamarck, you look at Darwin, Lamarck's already provided a very similar model of why human nature might in part be animal nature. The fact that it's this chain rather than a branching tree of descent doesn't really make that much difference. We've already got a working model of why human beings are in part animal. Now, Darwin himself was at first incredibly coy about the human-animal connection. Here he is, writing at the beginning of Origin and saying, light will be thrown on the origin of man and his history. That's what he said. And then what else did he say about Homo sapiens in the rest of Origin? He said absolutely nothing whatsoever. He kept his trap shut. He tantalized everybody with this. On top of which, I think I threw this in just to be contrary. He was still maintaining that the creator might have a role in Origin, by the way. There's still a bit of theology in there. Was he doing this just to be tricky, deceitful, cunning, to cloak what he was up to? Or was this something that he believed? Was he putting it in there for his wife? Authors of the highest eminence seem to be fully satisfied with the view that each species has been independently created. To my mind, it accords better with what we know of the laws impressed on matter by the Creator. This is in Origin. He mentions Creator more than he mentions man in Origin. That the production and extinction of the past and present inhabitants of the world should have been due to secondary causes. So he's got a bit of room for designing God going on in there, designing the whole thing. But anyway, he doesn't say an awful lot about man in Origin. Why do you think that's the case? What do you reckon? I think he knew it was going to be controversial, and I think that he wanted to leave it aside because possibly he felt that it would detract. So he holds it over for another day. He passes it over for another day. But as it was, the only thing that anybody could talk about was the human-monkey relationship. Now, Darwin might have wanted to avoid it, but from day one, that was all anyone thought about. In all of the reviews, in all of the debates, it was all about man and monkey. Couldn't do anything about that. Of course, it was going to take him another 10 years before he really let fly on the human-animal relationship. So where did the title of the lecture come from? It came from good old Charles Lyell, author of the Principles of Geology, writing a book on the antiquity of mankind, talking to Darwin all the time, saying, yes, Darwin, I am going to write about the animal-human thing. In fact, I'm going to go the whole orang. That's what he said. Now, when his book came out, and I think it was 1863, he decidedly failed to go the whole orang. He wrote about how Darwin had written an excellent book, but he wanted to sidestep the origins of the human species. And this prompted Darwin to get very, very cross with him. Darwin was... There were a couple of occasions in Darwin's life where he got cross with Charles Lyell, and this is one of them. "I'm fearfully disappointed at Lyell's caution," was what he said, because he had signally failed to go the whole harangue. The 1850s and the 1860s were really the time of the ape, the time of the gorilla. Guy the gorilla, who filled my childhood imagination, was on the television all the time. There was nothing better than a trip to London Zoo to go and look at Guy the gorilla, one of the wonders of the natural world. And it was during the 1850s that Paul de Chaillu brought the first specimen of gorilla back from Africa, where he had been on one of those kind of heart of darkness adventures, back to Europe to demonstrate this animal that appeared to be so close to human beings and at the same time incredibly savage. As a side, as a coda to this, when you go to the Melbourne Zoo, you would be able to see the gorillas in Melbourne Zoo. Those gorillas, and actually I'm going to talk more about animals in the next lecture. I'm going to leave this as the last tantalizing story about the human-person relationship. Those gorillas were there for an evolutionary purpose. Frederick McCoy was the first professor of the life sciences at the University of Melbourne, and he was a rabid anti-Darwinian. He was also the individual that established what becomes the National Museum of Victoria, the Melbourne Museum, which is why the gorillas have ended up there. But he brought the gorillas to Melbourne for one purpose and one purpose only, and that was to demonstrate how unlike human beings they were. Foremost in his mind was that he could use these museum specimens, which would have been housed at the time over in Old Quad, which was where the original museum was. He brought them over to show people how unlike human beings gorillas were, to try and establish that there was some sort of rupture, some sort of break, some sort of thing that retained the specialness, the special quality, the divine quality of the human species. And in a way, this is a kind of parenthesis to the debate that I'm going to talk about at the beginning of the next lecture, which is the debate between Owen and Huxley over the structure of the gorilla's brain. Because it's in that debate that we see man's place in nature emerging most strongly in the post-Origin period. It is the debate which is known as the re-slaying of the slain debate.